People ask why I left Raven Gap Ranger Station and why I never worked another mountain assignment afterward. The truth is that I did not leave because of the isolation, the long patrols, or the weather. I left because of a voice that came through a radio on the last night I spent there. It was 3:11 in the morning. The station sat alone beneath a dark Appalachian ridgeline, surrounded by wet pine forest and low clouds tangled in the trees. Rain from earlier in the evening dripped steadily from the roof. The backup generator hummed behind the maintenance shed. Somewhere beyond the floodlights, water moved through a rocky creek bed. Everything felt ordinary. Ordinary is the part nobody believes afterward. I was sitting in the communications room, finishing paperwork when the radio crackled. Not a normal dispatch transmission, not a weather update, just a burst of static that rolled through the speaker before settling into silence. I looked up. The radio clicked once. Then a man spoke. Evan Mercer. Hearing my name was not unusual. Rangers hear their names on the radio all the time. What mattered was the way he said it, not as a question, not as identification. More like someone checking whether I was still exactly where he expected me to be. I reached for the microphone. Go ahead. The moment I said it, I remembered the rule. My hand froze around the mic. I looked at the frequency display. Channel 7. The one the rule sheet said to ignore after midnight. For a second, I considered ending the transmission right there. Instead, I waited. The speaker hissed softly. Then the voice returned. You finally made it through the winter. I stared at the radio. I had never worked a winter at Raven Gap. In fact, I had only been assigned there a few months earlier. The room suddenly felt smaller, not colder, just tighter, like all the empty space had disappeared. Who is this? I asked. Outside, wind moved through the trees. A loose metal panel somewhere near the storage shed tapped once against a post. The caller did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke again, his voice sounded tired, exhausted almost, as if he had been trying to reach someone for a very long time. You already know who I'm supposed to be. Then the transmission ended. No static, no sign-off, nothing, just silence. At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. I didn't understand why Channel 7 existed. I didn't understand why 6 simple rules had been taped beside the radio. The rule had never explained what would happen if someone answered. Only that no ranger who ignored it ever stayed until spring. And I definitely didn't understand why every ranger before me seemed afraid to talk about it. To explain any of that, I need to go back to my first day at Raven Gap, because that's where the story really starts. My first day at Raven Gap began in clean daylight, which made every warning feel embarrassed to exist. The access road climbed 11 miles through switchbacks, wet leaves, and broken gravel. By the time I reached the top, my truck was coated in mud, and the cell signal had vanished from the dashboard. The forest opened around a cinder block ranger station with a tin roof, 2 equipment sheds, a weather mast, and a flagpole standing motionless in the afternoon air. It looked practical. Lonely, but practical. After what had happened in my last district, practical was exactly what I wanted. I had spent 9 years working as a ranger before arriving at Raven Gap. Trail maintenance, visitor assistance, wildfire watches, search operations, and enough paperwork to fill a cabin. I knew how to read weather patterns, track footprints through wet soil, and stay calm when a family realized a loved one wasn't coming back on schedule. I also knew what it sounded like when a search stopped being a rescue. That was one reason I accepted the transfer. Raven Gap needed a full-time ranger for a temporary assignment, and I needed a place where nobody knew the name of the boy we never found. The outgoing ranger was waiting on the front porch when I arrived. His name was Daniel Pike. He looked too young to be leaving the job and too tired to be starting another one. His uniform was clean. His boots were polished. Yet every few seconds, his eyes drifted toward the tree line beyond the parking area. Not nervously, habitually, as if he had spent too long checking for something he never expected to see. He shook my hand once. Mercer? Evan? Pike. That was the entire introduction. He picked up a clipboard and led me inside. The station smelled like old paper, damp concrete, pine cleaner, and coffee that had probably been reheated too many times. A narrow hallway connected the bunk room, kitchen, supply closet, office, and communications room. Everything looked ordinary, the kind of place a ranger could spend months in without collecting a single story worth telling. Then I noticed the communications room. Unlike every other door in the building, it was locked. I nodded toward it. Equipment security? Pike glanced at the door before answering. Something like that. We finished the tour, checked the generator shed, and reviewed the weather station. When we finally returned to the hallway, he stopped in front of the communications room. I expected him to unlock it immediately. Instead, he stood there for a moment, with the brass key in his hand. "You'll be responsible for all radio traffic," he said. "Standard procedure." Mostly. That word caught my attention. Mostly. I looked at him. He looked back. Neither of us said anything for several seconds. Then I smiled. "Radio equipment that valuable?" He didn't smile back. "No," he said, "just easy to misuse." Before turning the key, Pike glanced once down the hallway behind us, as if making sure the station itself wasn't listening. Then he unlocked the door. The communications room was colder than the rest of the station, not by much, just enough that I noticed it when I stepped across the threshold. A metal desk sat against the far wall beneath a row of mounted radios, frequency charts, and laminated emergency numbers. 2 analog units were old enough to have yellowed labels beneath their dials. A newer digital base station blinked beside them, quiet and harmless looking. Coiled cords hung from hooks. Spare batteries were stacked in a plastic bin. On the desk lay a logbook, 3 sharpened pencils, and a clipboard with my name already written at the top. It should have felt familiar. Every station has a room like that. Every ranger knows the smell of warm dust inside radio equipment and the low electrical hum that settles underneath silence. But Pike did not step fully inside. He stayed near the doorway. That was the first thing I noticed. The second was the laminated sheet taped beside the main radio. 6 numbered rules, typed in plain black lettering. No title, no explanation, just rules. I leaned closer. Pike spoke before I could read them. Those stay where they are. I wasn't planning to steal them. I mean, don't move them. Don't cover them. Don't decide they look unprofessional and file them somewhere. I glanced back at him. He was serious. That bothered me more than the rules themselves. In my experience, strange local policies usually came from ordinary problems. A locked gate meant teenagers had been trespassing. A warning sign near a creek meant someone had slipped on algae. A weird radio procedure meant some supervisor had embarrassed himself during an emergency drill. So I looked at the sheet, expecting something like that. Instead, the first line read, 1. Never answer transmissions on Channel 7 after sunset. I waited for the joke hidden inside the wording. There wasn't one. The second rule was worse because it sounded less like equipment protocol and more like advice from someone who had survived a bad decision. 2. If a voice identifies itself by full name before you ask, end the transmission immediately. I read it twice. Then I looked at Pike. Pike's eyes moved from the sheet to the radios, like he expected one of them to object. That was the moment the room stopped feeling ordinary. Outside, sunlight stretched across the parking lot. Wind moved through the pines. Somewhere beyond the station, a woodpecker hammered against a dead tree. Everything outside was bright and reasonable. Inside, someone had taped fear to government property. I lowered my eyes to the remaining rules. 4 more waited below. The first 2 sounded impossible. The next 4 sounded like they had been written after someone failed to come back. The third rule was written in the same plain font as the first 2, but it bothered me in a different way. 3. If the weather station reports clear skies, but you hear thunder, remain indoors. I looked toward the small window above the desk. The afternoon sky was pale blue between the trees. No clouds, no distant storm line. Just quiet ridges and sunlight caught in the upper branches. Thunder? I asked. Pike did not answer right away. That was becoming his habit. Sound carries strangely in the gap, he said. It was the kind of explanation a man gives when he wants the conversation to move on. The fourth rule made that harder. 4. Do not investigate lights below the eastern ridgeline after midnight. I turned back to him. Campers? Sometimes. You want me to ignore possible illegal camping? I want you to log it. And if somebody needs help? Pike's jaw tightened. Log it. That was the first time I disliked him. Not because he was rude. He wasn't. Not because he seemed unstable. He didn't. I disliked him because he had answered like a man who had already made that choice and learned to live with it. The fifth rule was worse. 5. If the radio requests a welfare check at Bearwallow Fire Tower, report the message, but do not respond. I knew the name from the district map. Bearwallow Tower had been marked inactive for years. Is the tower still standing? No. Then why would anyone request a welfare check there? Pike looked at the radios again. That's one of the questions you stop asking. The sixth rule sat at the bottom of the sheet, separated from the others by a blank space. 6. At 3:13 a.m., all radios must remain powered off until sunrise, regardless of incoming traffic. I almost laughed then. Not because it was funny, because the alternative was taking it seriously. Pike must have seen it on my face. You don't need to understand them, he said. You just need to follow them. I tapped the edge of the laminated sheet. "These are official? They're station policy. That isn't what I asked." "No," he said, "it isn't." For a few seconds, the only sound was the low hum from the equipment rack. Then Pike reached across the desk and opened the logbook. The first page contained normal entries: weather checks, trail closures, generator fuel levels. But written in the margin beside a date from the previous spring were 4 words in red pen. Channel 7 attempted contact. Pike closed the book before I could read further. His fingers stayed on the cover a second too long, like he was holding something shut. "Radio check every 2 hours," he said. "Copy." "And Evan?" I looked up. "Don't miss one." By the second morning, Raven Gap had almost convinced me to be reasonable. That is the dangerous thing about daylight in the mountains. It explains everything for you before you can ask the wrong questions. Fog becomes weather. Creaking walls become temperature change. A locked communications room becomes old equipment security. 6 strange rules become local procedure written by tired men with bad sleep and too much time alone. I made coffee in the narrow kitchen before sunrise and watched the ridge turn gray through the window above the sink. The generator had shifted into its steady daytime rhythm. Somewhere outside, a crow called once, answered by another farther down the valley. Normal sounds. Normal work. That morning, my assignment list was exactly what I expected from a remote post. Inspect the lower switchback trail, check 2 drainage culverts, replace a missing blaze marker, photograph erosion near the creek crossing, and update the visitor board near the parking area. Nothing about it felt haunted. It felt underfunded. I spent the first half of the day walking wet trail with a Pulaski over my shoulder and a radio clipped to my vest. The air smelled like leaf mold, pine sap, and rain drying off bark. My boots sank into soft patches of clay. Rhododendron crowded the trail edges so tightly that my sleeves brushed wet leaves whenever the path narrowed. Near mile marker 2, my radio clicked once. No dispatch, no voice, just one clean click, followed by the usual soft hiss. I waited a few seconds, then checked the channel. Not 7. That was enough to let me call it equipment noise. Raven Gap was beautiful in the practical way dangerous places often are. Steep slopes, loose rock, sudden drop-offs hidden by fern growth. The kind of terrain that could kill a careless hiker without needing help from anything supernatural. That thought comforted me more than it should have. I logged a washed-out step near mile marker 2, cleared deadfall from a bend, and found fresh bear scat near the creek. Around noon, 2 hikers from Knoxville stopped at the trailhead kiosk and asked whether the upper loop was safe after rain. I gave them the standard answer. Safe if you turn around before dark. They laughed like people do when they think a ranger is being overly cautious. One of them asked whether the Tower Trail was open. I looked up from the map. There isn't a Tower Trail on the public map. He frowned. Saw it mentioned online. Then the map online is wrong. I said it more sharply than I meant to. I did not mention the rules. By late afternoon, I had enough ordinary problems to fill 3 pages of notes. Drainage issue, missing signage, fallen limb near North Spur, possible bear activity, real things, fixable things. The kind of things that made Raven Gap feel like a job again, instead of a warning someone had handed me on laminated paper. When I returned to the station, sunlight lay across the parking area. Pike's truck was gone. The porch was empty. The communications room door stood closed at the end of the hallway. For a while, I told myself that was all it was. A room, a radio, a list of rules. Then the 2-hour radio check alarm beeped from my watch, and the ordinary day began to narrow around that locked door. The first radio check at Raven Gap should have been the easiest part of the job. Every 2 hours, I was supposed to contact district dispatch, give my station number, confirm status, record weather conditions, and log anything unusual. It was routine enough that my hands moved before I thought about them. I unlocked the communications room and stepped inside. The air still felt colder. Not dramatic, not impossible, just that slight difference, the way a basement feels colder even when the thermostat says it should not. I set the logbook on the desk, wrote the time, and powered on the main unit. Green numbers glowed across the display. The speaker gave a low, dusty hiss. District, Raven Gap Station. Scheduled radio check. A pause. Then dispatch answered, clear and bored. Raven Gap, district copies. Status, station secure, weather clear. Trail maintenance completed on lower switchback. No active incidents. Copy. Next check at 1800. Copy? That should have been the end of it. I reached for the power switch. Before I touched it, one of the old analog radios clicked. Not the digital base station, the left analog unit. The one with the yellowing label and a dial that looked like it belonged in a museum. Static breathed through the speaker. I looked at the frequency. Channel 7. The room went very still. It was not sunset yet. The rule said after sunset. A small, rational part of my mind grabbed on to that detail immediately, as if technicalities had ever saved anyone from anything. Maybe sunset was not the beginning. Maybe it was only when things became strong enough to answer back. The static shifted. For half a second, I thought I heard a word buried inside it. Not enough to identify, not enough to log, just the shape of a voice behind the noise. I leaned closer before I realized I was doing it. The radio clicked again. Then silence. I stood there with my hand above the desk, listening to nothing. Outside the room, the station was ordinary. Pipes ticked in the walls. Wind moved under the porch roof. Somewhere in the kitchen, the refrigerator compressor rattled awake. Inside, the rules no longer felt like a joke. I opened the logbook to record the interference, then stopped. Several older entries had been written with the same careful wording. Brief signal disturbance, unconfirmed traffic, channel anomaly. One entry from May had been crossed out so heavily the paper had torn. None of them said what the ranger had actually heard. That bothered me more than a warning would have. A warning tells you what someone believes. An omission tells you what someone is afraid to write down. I wrote only one line. 1741. Brief interference on Channel 7. No response given. Then I closed the book and turned the radio off. For the next 2 hours, I kept telling myself I had handled it correctly. But when the sun dropped behind the ridge, I found myself watching the old analog unit instead of the windows. Sunset arrived faster than I expected. That happens in the mountains. 1 minute, the ridges are catching the last orange light of the day. The next, the valleys have already fallen into shadow. By 1900 hours, Raven Gap felt like a different station. Not because anything had changed, because daylight had stopped explaining things. I finished updating trail reports at the office desk and glanced toward the communications room for what was probably the 10th time in an hour. The door was open. The old analog radio sat exactly where it had been all afternoon, silent, waiting. I hated that I was thinking about it. The rational part of my brain kept offering explanations. Old equipment picks up interference. Remote stations attract rumors. Rangers working alone invent patterns because the alternative is admitting how isolated they are. The explanations sounded reasonable. None of them stopped me from checking the clock. 1924. 24 minutes after sunset. I finally carried my paperwork into the communications room for the next scheduled radio check. The station seemed quieter at night. Not silent, just stripped down to essential sounds. The hum of electrical equipment, the occasional creak from cooling metal, wind moving through the trees outside. I logged the time and contacted dispatch. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. Routine. Boring. Exactly what I wanted. District, Raven Gap, scheduled check. District copies. Station secure. No incidents. Copy. Next report in 2 hours. That should have reassured me. Instead, it made the room feel emptier after the transmission ended. I set the microphone down. The speaker hissed softly. Then another sound appeared beneath the static. A click. Not loud, not mechanical, intentional. The sort of sound someone makes before speaking. My eyes shifted towards the analog unit, channel 7. The frequency display glowed steadily. The radio remained silent. For several seconds, nothing happened. I almost laughed at myself. Then a voice emerged from the speaker. Ranger station. The words were distorted beneath static, but unmistakably human. I froze. The voice continued. Ranger station. Do you copy? Male, adult, breathing hard. The breathing sounded too close to the microphone, but there was no wind behind it. The transmission sounded remarkably normal. That was the problem. Nothing about it matched the kind of bizarre experience I had been unconsciously expecting. It sounded exactly like a lost hiker trying to reach help. Training took over immediately. Every ranger learns the same instinct. Somebody calls for assistance, you answer. Simple, professional, automatic. My hand moved toward the microphone. Then I looked at the laminated rule sheet beside the desk. Never answer transmissions on channel 7 after sunset. The room suddenly felt very small. The voice returned. We've got a situation out here. A burst of static swallowed the rest. I stayed where I was, listening, waiting, trying to decide whether I was hearing equipment interference or a person who genuinely needed help. The difference mattered. One possibility meant following the rules. The other meant ignoring everything I had spent years training myself to do. The transmission crackled again. Please respond. A pause. Then fainter. We're below the eastern... Static cut the sentence in half. Outside, darkness settled deeper across the valley. Inside, my hand hovered inches above the microphone. And for the first time since arriving at Raven Gap, I understood why Pike had answered every question except the important ones. I wish I could tell you I followed the rule. I wish I could tell you I shut the radio off, logged the transmission, and walked away. That would make me sound like the kind of ranger who learns from warnings. Instead, I did what most people would have done. I listened. The voice sounded exhausted. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just tired in the way people sound after being cold, lost, and frightened for too long. Ranger Station, do you copy? Static crackled around the words. I stared at the microphone. Every instinct I had built over 9 years pushed me toward it. A missing hiker does not care about station policy. A lost person does not care about local folklore. If somebody is asking for help, you answer. That is how the job works. The rule sat inches from my hand. Never answer transmissions on Channel 7 after sunset. No explanation. No justification. Just an order. For a few seconds, I convinced myself that was important. Then the voice returned. We need assistance. Need. Not want, not request. Need. That single word broke whatever resistance I had left. I picked up the microphone. Unidentified caller. This is Raven Gap Ranger Station. State your location and emergency. The moment I released the transmit button, the radio went silent. Completely silent. The static disappeared. The hiss vanished. Even the faint background noise was gone. I had spent enough time around radios to know that kind of silence was wrong. Then the caller answered. Thank you, Evan. My grip tightened. I had never given my name. I glanced toward the station hallway. Empty. The office. Empty. Only the radio. Only the voice. Identify yourself. The speaker clicked once. You already know me. No. Yes. The response came immediately. Too immediately. Like the voice had expected the conversation before it happened. I looked down at the frequency display. Channel 7 remained steady. No fluctuation. No interference. Nothing that suggested equipment failure. The caller spoke again. 16 years old. I froze. Gray hoodie. The room seemed to shrink around me. Blue backpack. My mouth went dry. Left boot untied. The microphone slipped slightly in my hand. Nobody should have known those details. The boy from my previous district had been 16. He had worn a gray hoodie. His backpack had been blue. And during the search, one deputy had noted a strange drag pattern from an untied bootlace near a creek crossing. That information never appeared in the official report. The public never heard it. Most of the search team never heard it. Yet the voice knew. Outside, wind brushed through the trees. Inside, I could hear my own breathing. Who are you? For a moment, I thought the transmission had ended. Then the voice returned, quieter now, almost sympathetic. Evan? The way it said my name felt familiar. Not because I recognized the speaker, because it sounded like someone trying to comfort me. You left him below the waterline. I hit the power switch. The analog radio died instantly. Dark display, dead speaker, dead channel. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the newer digital base station powered on by itself. Green light. Static. The laminated rules trembled slightly against the wall from the vibration coming through the speaker. And from that cleaner radio, using the same calm voice, came 4 words. You answered, Evan. Then the speaker clicked. Once, like a door closing. I did not sleep much after the digital radio turned itself on. Sleep felt irresponsible. That sounds dramatic now, but at the time it felt practical. The station had one locked communications room, 6 rules taped beside the radios, and something inside the equipment that knew details from a search file 3 counties away. I spent the rest of that night sitting at the office desk with every radio powered off, not unplugged. I tried that once. The silence that followed felt worse than static. At sunrise, the station looked harmless again. Pale light came through the kitchen windows. Rainwater shone on the porch railing. The eastern ridgeline stood blue and quiet beyond the trees, giving no sign that anything under it had spoken through a radio. That was the part I hated most. The forest did not look guilty. I made the 6 o'clock radio check through the district channel and kept my voice steady. Raven Gap Station, morning status. Dispatch answered with the same tired boredom as always. Raven Gap, district copies. No one asked why my voice sounded thin. No one asked whether Channel 7 had attempted contact. No one acted like anything at Raven Gap could be unusual. After the check-in, I opened the logbook again. This time, I went backward. Most of the recent entries were ordinary: fuel levels, trail closures, maintenance notes, weather observations. But the older the records became, the more careful the language turned. Not stranger. Careful. Brief signal disturbance. No response given. Eastern ridge lights observed. Logged only. Possible thunder event. Weather clear. Those phrases appeared across years in different handwriting. Different rangers. Same restraint. Then I found a name written more often than the others. Walter Griggs. Sometimes he signed reports as W. Griggs. Sometimes other rangers mentioned him in margins. Once, beside an entry marked Channel 7 attempted contact, someone had written, "Griggs survived because he stopped answering." I stared at that sentence for a long time. Survived was not a word people used for faulty radio equipment. The district directory still had an old number listed under retired personnel. I almost did not call it. Some part of me knew that once I asked the question out loud, Raven Gap would stop being a strange assignment and become something I had chosen to investigate. I dialed anyway. The phone rang 6 times. Then a man answered. "Who is this?" His voice was rough, older, and already suspicious. "My name is Evan Mercer. I'm the new ranger at Raven Gap." The line went quiet. Not dead. Quiet. On the other end, I heard something scrape softly, like he had stood up too fast. When Walter Griggs spoke again, his voice had changed. "You answered it, didn't you?" I did not answer him right away. That was enough. Walter Griggs exhaled through the phone, not like a man disappointed in me, but like a man hearing weather he had warned someone about for years. "Shut the radios off," he said. "They are off." "All of them?" I looked toward the communications room. The door was closed. The station seemed too quiet behind it. "Yes." "Don't trust the switches." I waited for him to explain. He didn't. Instead, he asked, "Did it use your name first?" "No?" "Then you're luckier than some." I wrote that down without meaning to. Luckier than some. "What is Channel 7? Walter was quiet long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, "It isn't a channel. Not really." The words made no sense, but he said them with the flat certainty of someone describing a scar. "It's a gap," he continued, "a place in the system where something figured out how to be heard." I glanced at the wall map. Raven Gap was marked in black ink near the center ridge. The name suddenly felt less like geography and more like a warning. Walter told me he had worked the station 23 years earlier with a partner named Samuel Rusk. Sam was local, quiet, careful, the kind of ranger who checked fuel cans twice and never joked over the radio. One winter, Sam went missing during a storm response below the eastern ridgeline. They searched for 9 days. No body, no pack, no tracks after the creek crossing. 3 days after the search was suspended, Channel 7 activated. Walter was alone in the communications room when Sam's voice came through. Not a recording, not static shaped like speech. Sam. He sounded cold, Walter said. That was the worst part. Not scared, cold. The voice asked Walter to come get him near Bearwallow Tower. But Bearwallow had burned years before. Walter answered anyway. Then he followed the voice into the trees. He made it almost 2 miles before he realized the snow under his boots had no footprints except his own. Sunrise found him kneeling beside an old tower foundation with a dead handheld radio that still felt warm in his palm. I asked what stopped him. Walter's voice dropped. The sun came up before I reached what was calling. Then he said the thing I wrote in the logbook margins and never forgot. Raven Gap doesn't kill you all at once, Mercer. The line went quiet for a second. Then he finished. It convinces you to help. After Walter hung up, I stayed beside the desk with the phone still in my hand. The station felt different now. Not louder, not darker, just less empty. That was worse. Empty places have limits. You can measure them by walls, doors, windows, and square footage. But Raven Gap no longer felt empty. It felt occupied by everything nobody had been willing to say out loud. I went back to the communications room. Morning light still reached the window above the radios, but it had lost its authority. The same daylight that made the trail work feel normal now only showed me details I had missed before. Dust gathered behind the analog unit. Old tape residue marked the wall around the laminated rules. The logbook sat on the desk exactly where Pike had left it, closed and harmless looking. I opened it again. This time, I did not stop at recent entries. The first binder covered the current year. Behind it, in the lower file cabinet, I found older volumes wrapped in rubber bands. Some were official station logs. Some were maintenance ledgers. Some had no labels at all. One binder had a strip of masking tape across its spine, with my station number written over another ranger's name. I carried them to the desk, one at a time. The paper smelled dry and stale, like a closet that had not been opened in years. At first, the records were ordinary. Weather checks, trail closures, bear sightings, washed-out culverts, visitor complaints about locked restrooms. Then the language began to repeat. Channel 7 event. Eastern lights observed. Identity confirmed before inquiry. I copied the phrases into my notebook and started marking dates. That was when I noticed the pattern. The entries were not clustered around storms or tourist seasons. They appeared across decades, always after a new ranger had been assigned, always after someone had made first contact. Different handwriting, different years, same careful fear. One entry from 1998 read, caller used Ranger Keller's full name before station identification. No response logged afterward. I read that sentence 3 times. No response logged afterward. It did not say Keller survived. It did not say Keller disappeared. It only stopped talking about him. I checked the next month. Different ranger signature, different handwriting. The station had replaced him without explaining why. I sat back slowly. The rules had not been written to prevent strange things from happening. They had been written because strange things kept happening anyway. And somewhere inside those old pages, the station had learned how to describe losing people without admitting they were gone. Ranger Keller was not the name that stayed with me. Thomas Harlan was. I found him in a folder wedged behind the oldest logbook, the kind of place someone uses when they want a record preserved, but not easily discovered. The folder was soft from damp, its edges feathered and brown. Across the tab, someone had written one word in pencil: Harlan. Inside were 3 incident reports, 2 weather summaries, a photocopied district map, and 1 handwritten page torn from a field notebook. The official report said Ranger Thomas Harlan disappeared in October of 1989 while investigating unauthorized lights near the eastern ridgeline. That phrase appeared again. Eastern ridgeline. The report claimed poor visibility, rain, and difficult terrain complicated the search. Reasonable words. Safe words. Then I read the handwritten page. Harlan had received repeated welfare check requests from Bearwallow Fire Tower 3 nights before he vanished. The tower had already been inactive then, not burned yet, just closed. The calls came at odd intervals, always after midnight, always asking whether someone could confirm a ranger was still on site. The wording bothered me. Not a hiker, not an injured camper, a ranger. On the final night, Harlan logged 1 sentence beneath the request. The radio knew where I was standing. His final signature was neat, as if he still believed paperwork could keep him safe. I read it once, then again. Then I checked the map. Bearwallow Tower sat below the eastern ridgeline, near an old maintenance road that no longer appeared on current maps. A red pencil line connected it to 3 other disappearance sites across nearly 40 years. The line did not follow trails. It followed the valley. At the bottom of the folder, I found a photograph. Black and white, blurry from age. A man in a ranger jacket stood beside the foundation of a fire tower. Behind him, the mountain dropped into fog. Someone had circled the tree line in red ink. At first, I saw nothing. Then I held the photo closer to the desk lamp. Between 2 trunks, barely visible, stood a second figure, too far back to identify, too straight to be a branch. On the back of the photo, someone had written, "Taken 3 days after Harlan stopped answering." The communications room seemed to tighten around me. I looked at the wall map again. Raven Gap Station, Eastern Ridgeline, Bearwallow Tower, Channel 7. They were not separate mysteries. They were points on the same route. And for the first time, I wondered whether the radio was calling people to the tower, or whether the tower was only where the forest taught the radio what to say. After finding Harlan's file, I stopped thinking of Channel 7 as a single event. That was the mistake I had been making. I kept treating every transmission like an isolated incident. One strange call, one strange voice, One strange night. The record suggested something different. The pattern continued. The thing behind the radio adapted. It learned. For the next several days, I followed the rules more carefully than ever. I logged every radio check. I ignored Channel 7 completely. I stayed away from the eastern ridgeline after dark. I recorded weather conditions twice as often as required. None of it made me feel safer. It only made me feel observed. The first sign was small. During a routine afternoon transmission, District Dispatch mentioned a trail closure near Morgan Creek. The conversation lasted less than 20 seconds. Nothing unusual. No Channel 7 activity. No interference. That night, just after sunset, the analog radio clicked once. I froze immediately. The speaker remained silent for several seconds. Then a voice emerged from the static. Morgan Creek remains closed. My stomach tightened. The exact wording dispatch had used earlier that day. Not similar. Exact. I shut the radio off. The next evening, it happened again. A maintenance supervisor had called earlier, asking whether replacement signs had arrived from Knoxville. At 8:13 p.m., Channel 7 repeated the same question. Word for word. The voice sounded different each time. Sometimes male, sometimes female, sometimes older, sometimes younger. The information stayed accurate. The speakers changed. That was worse. By the fourth incident, I stopped believing the transmissions were recordings. Recordings repeat. These responded. The realization came during a conversation with Walter. I was sitting at the station desk, describing the latest transmission, when he interrupted me. Did it mention anything that happened after the first call? Yes. Walter was quiet. How recent? This morning. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded tired. Then it's listening. I looked toward the communications room. The door was open. The radios were powered off. Yet I found myself lowering my voice anyway. What does that mean? It means somebody answered. The answer irritated me. I know I answered. No, Walter said. I mean, somebody always answers. Before I could ask what that meant, he changed the subject. That bothered me more than the statement itself. Because Walter had the habit of avoiding questions only when he actually knew the answer. The next transmission arrived 2 nights later. I had just finished speaking with 2 hikers near the parking area. One had complained about the steep climb to the north overlook. The other joked that Raven Gap needed better coffee. The exchange lasted maybe 30 seconds. Nothing important. Nothing worth remembering. At 9:07 p.m., Channel 7 activated. Static filled the room. Then a woman's voice spoke. Calm, clear, almost conversational. Better coffee might help. The radio clicked. Once. Then silence returned. For several seconds, I sat motionless. Not because the statement was threatening, because it wasn't. After the transmission, I checked the parking area and found the gravel undisturbed. No fresh tire marks, no footprints near the porch, no sign anyone had stood close enough to hear us. The transmission had repeated something nobody outside the parking area should have heard. Something trivial. Something useless. Which meant whatever was listening no longer cared only about emergencies. It was paying attention. And the more attention it paid, the the more I began to suspect that answering Channel 7 had not started a conversation. It had introduced me. The first time it used my father's voice, I almost answered. That is the part I hate admitting. Not because I believed it was really him. I knew better. By then, I had seen too much pattern in the logs and heard too many borrowed voices through old speakers. I knew Channel 7 was not bringing people back. It was using people the way a fisherman uses bait. Still, knowing a trap is a trap does not stop your hand from reaching toward it. My father had been dead for 6 years. Heart attack, kitchen floor, coffee still warm on the counter when my mother found him. He had never worked Raven Gap, never used district radio, never knew the boy we failed to find in my last assignment. There was no rational path from him to that room. But grief does not care about rational paths. It was almost midnight when the analog unit clicked on. I had been reviewing old maps and pretending I was not waiting for it. Static gathered first. Then came a soft breath. Not the breathing from the lost hiker call. This was slower, familiar. The kind of breath a man takes before saying something he has repeated 100 times. Evan. I did not move. The voice was older than I remembered, and exactly as tired as I remembered. Don't make your mother worry. For a second, I was 20 again, standing beside my father's truck while he checked the oil before a storm. My hand tightened around the pencil. The radio hissed. You always did carry guilt like it was useful. That almost broke me. Not because it was cruel, because it sounded like something he might have said. I stood up slowly and backed away from the desk. The rule sheet trembled slightly in the equipment hum. The voice continued. Pick up the mic, son. I closed my eyes. Then it made its mistake. You remember Lake Briar? I opened my eyes. There was no Lake Briar. There had been a Briar Creek, a small place behind our house where my father taught me how to skip stones. The voice had the emotion right, the detail wrong. That difference saved me. I switched off the analog radio and did not speak. For a moment, silence held. The display stayed black. Then, from the dark speaker, came my father's voice again, softer now. Good boy. That was when I understood. It was not only learning facts, it was learning which wounds to press. The first thunder came on a night with a perfect weather report. Clear skies, low wind, no storm cells within 60 miles. I checked twice because I wanted the computer to correct itself. It did not. At 12:18 a.m., the station windows gave a soft tremble in their frames. Then the sound rolled across the valley, deep, slow, far away, but not far enough. Thunder. I stood in the office with one hand on the desk and listened until it faded into the ridgeline. The rule sheet came back to me before fear did. If the weather station reports clear skies, but you hear thunder, remain indoors. I went to the window out of habit, then stopped before touching the blind. Small decisions matter more when you are alone. That was something Raven Gap had taught me. I checked the weather station again. Clear. The sky camera showed stars over the mast. No lightning, no cloud cover, no rain. Then the thunder came again. This time closer. Not overhead. Not yet. But close enough that the floorboards under the desk gave a faint answering creak. I logged the time. Possible thunder event. Weather clear. the same careful words I had seen in old records. Writing them made me feel less like a witness and more like the next handwriting in a pattern. I called Walter from the office phone. He answered on the second ring. "You hearing it?" I looked toward the dark window. "Yes. Stay inside." "I am?" "No," he said. "I mean, stay inside the room you're in. Don't go checking doors. Don't look for damage. Don't make yourself useful." That last sentence landed harder than the warning. Don't make yourself useful. At Raven Gap, usefulness was how it reached people. Another roll of thunder moved through the valley. The radios stayed silent. That made it worse. I had started to understand Channel 7 as the mouth of the thing. But this sound came without radios. No speaker, no frequency. Just the mountain itself, answering something I could not hear. "How long does it last?" I asked. Walter breathed once through his nose. "Until it gets tired of waiting." "For what?" "For you to mistake it for weather." The line clicked faintly. For a second, I thought the connection had failed. Then Walter added, "The big disappearances usually start after thunder." Outside, the valley went quiet. Too quiet. Not peaceful. Paused. I sat at the desk until my legs ached and watched the weather screen continue to insist the sky was clear. At 12:41 a.m., the final roll came from directly behind the station. The air pressure changed enough to make my ears pop. No lightning followed. No rain touched the roof. But somewhere in the communications room, one of the analog radios clicked once, as if replying to it. Chapter 8. The Thunder with No Storm. Section 8.2. The click from the communications room faded before I reached the hallway. I stopped anyway. Walter was still on the phone. "Don't go in there," he said. I looked at the dark doorway. I heard a radio. I know. That answer bothered me more than another warning would have. The station had gone still again. No thunder, no rain, no generator stutter. Just the office phone pressed against my ear, and my own breathing making the hallway feel too narrow. Then I saw the first light below the eastern ridgeline. A single white point moved between the trees. For half a second, relief came before fear. A flashlight was understandable. A person was understandable. Then a second light appeared behind it. Then a third. They moved in a straight line across ground I knew was too steep for walking. Rule 4 rose in my mind without effort. Do not investigate lights below the eastern ridgeline after midnight. "Walter," I said quietly, "you see them?" It was not a question. The lights kept moving. Slow, even, perfectly spaced. No bobbing from footsteps, no shifting beams, no voices. They looked less like hikers and more like marks being dragged through the dark. I thought about the 2 hikers from Knoxville. I thought about illegal campers. I thought about all the ordinary reasons someone might be out there, and all the terrible reasons they might need help. That was how it worked. It gave you a shape your conscience could recognize. A light, a voice, a name, something small enough to make disobeying feel cruel. "I should report it," I said. "Log it," Walter answered. The same words Pike had used. This time, I understood the cost inside them. I sat at the desk and wrote with a hand that did not feel completely steady. 0044. 3 lights observed below eastern ridgeline. No response initiated. When I looked up again, there were 6 lights. all 6 beams, lifted at the same time and fixed on the station windows. The 6 lights stayed fixed on the station for almost 9 minutes. I know, because I watched the clock instead of the windows. That was another thing Raven Gap taught me. Do not stare too long at what wants to be seen. Walter remained on the phone the entire time, though neither of us said much. His breathing came through the receiver in slow, careful intervals. Once, he told me to keep writing. Not looking. Writing. So I did. 0047. Lights stationary. No response initiated. 0051. Lights remain visible. No movement toward station. 0053. Lights extinguished simultaneously. When I finally raised my eyes, the eastern ridgeline was dark again. No flashlights, no figures, no movement between the trees. Just black mountain and the faint reflection of my own face in the office window. Then the communications room radio clicked. Walter heard me stop breathing. Mercer? The analog unit clicked again. Once, then twice. Then the speaker filled with static. I did not enter the room. I stood in the hallway and listened from outside the doorway, like distance meant anything. A voice came through. Not my father's. Not the missing boy. Not any voice I recognized. It was calm and professional. Too professional. Raven Gap Station. Welfare check requested. Walter cursed softly on the line. The radio continued. Bearwallow Fire Tower. Ranger on site. Requires confirmation. I closed my eyes. Rule 5. If the radio requests a welfare check at Bearwallow Fire Tower, report the message, but do not respond. The voice repeated the request. Same wording, same tone. Raven Gap Station. Welfare check requested. Bearwallow Fire Tower. Ranger on site requires confirmation. I went to the desk and opened the district map with one hand. Bearwallow Fire Tower was not there. Not on the current map. Not on the visitor map. Not on the emergency response overlay. Only the old photocopy from Harlan's folder showed it. Below the eastern ridgeline, near the route those lights had followed. Walter, I said. I know. There's no active tower. There hasn't been one in decades. The radio crackled again. This time, the voice added coordinates. Exact coordinates. I wrote them down before I could stop myself. The numbers looked less like information and more like an invitation. Walter heard the pencil moving. Don't. I'm only logging. That's how it starts. The coordinates matched the old tower foundation, the same place Walter had woken at sunrise, the same place Harlan's photo had been taken 3 days after he stopped answering. The official world said Bearwallow no longer existed. But Channel 7 kept giving directions to it, and somewhere below the eastern ridgeline, something still expected Raven Gap to send a ranger. I waited until morning before I did something stupid. That was how I justified it. I did not go after midnight. I did not answer the welfare check. I did not follow the lights. I waited for daylight, packed standard field gear, filed a routine trail inspection note with district, and told myself the rules had not forbidden investigation after sunrise. Rules without explanations invite negotiation. I should have known that by then. The coordinates led off the maintained trail and down an old maintenance grade half swallowed by rhododendron. Recent maps did not show it, but the land remembered. The grade cut through the slope with a steadiness natural trails rarely have. Too straight in places, too deliberate beneath the leaf litter. My radio stayed clipped to my vest, powered off. I checked it every few minutes anyway. By 10:30, the forest had gone quiet in that heavy Appalachian way, where silence feels layered instead of empty. No birdsong, no squirrels snapping branches. Only my boots pressing damp leaves into mud, and my own breathing inside my ears. I found the clearing just before noon. There was no tower, only 4 concrete footings in a square, rusted bolts rising from them like broken teeth. Moss covered the old foundation. Ferns grew through cracks. A fallen cable lay half buried near a rotted signpost with no sign attached. For a minute, I felt disappointed. That bothered me. Some part of me had expected proof. Then I saw the footprints, fresh, human-sized, several sets crossing the clearing from different directions, though no trail entered from anywhere except the grade I had used. I knelt beside one print. Boot tread, modern, wet soil pressed clean at the edges, no leaves inside it. Someone had been there recently, or something had learned how boots should look. Near the eastern footing, I found 3 radio batteries arranged in a straight line, not scattered, placed. Their contacts were corroded green, but the plastic casings felt warm when I touched them. I stepped back. The clearing suddenly felt less abandoned than prepared. At the base of the rotted signpost, half hidden under leaves, something metal caught the light. A ranger badge, old style, tarnished. The name stamped across it was barely readable, but I knew it before I wiped the dirt away. Thomas Harlan. I stood there, holding a dead man's badge in clear noon daylight, and the forest around Bearwallow Tower remained perfectly still. Then my powered-off radio clicked against my vest, once. Not transmitting, not receiving, just acknowledging that I had arrived. I left Bearwallow before the radio could click a second time. There are moments when bravery and stupidity wear the same uniform, and a person only knows the difference afterward. Standing in that clearing with Thomas Harlan's badge in my palm, I understood I had crossed from investigation into invitation. The forest had not stopped me. That was what frightened me. It had let me arrive. By the time I reached Raven Gap Station, the afternoon had turned gray. Clouds gathered over the ridgeline in slow, heavy layers, though the weather station still showed clear conditions. I logged the badge as recovered evidence without naming where I found it. Then I locked it in the desk drawer and sat beside it until sunset. I called Walter twice. No answer. That scared me more than if he had picked up angry. At 2100, I completed the scheduled radio check. Dispatch copied. Routine. At 2300, I checked again. Routine. At 0018, thunder rolled through a sky that still had stars above it. At 0031, 3 lights appeared below the eastern ridgeline. At 0044, there were 6. At 0106, the analog radio clicked without powering on. By then, I understood the night was not repeating earlier events. It was stacking them. Rule 3, Rule 4, Rule 5, Channel 7, one after another, like pressure building behind a door. I wrote everything down because writing was the only useful thing left that did not require answering. At 0217, every radio in the communications room began hissing at once. Not one unit, all of them. The analog sets, the digital base station, the handheld charger rack. Even the dead portable I kept unplugged in the supply cabinet buzzed behind its closed door. Voices moved underneath the static. Names, coordinates, fragments of old distress calls. Some I recognized from the logbooks: Keller, Harlan, Samuel Rusk. Others were strangers. All of them sounded close. I stood in the hallway and watched the rule sheet tremble against the wall. At 3:10, the station lights dimmed. At 3:11, the old analog unit clicked once. At 3:12, every voice stopped. The silence felt organized. I looked at the final rule. At 3:13 a.m., all radios must remain powered off until sunrise, regardless of incoming traffic. Then the clock changed. At 3:13 a.m., every radio powered on. Not one after another. All at once. The sound hit the station hard enough to make the windows tremble. Static filled the hallway, the office, the kitchen, the bunk room. It came from the communications room speakers, from the handheld units in their chargers, from the dead portable locked in the supply cabinet. A wall of sound. Then the voices arrived, hundreds of them. Some whispered, some called out calmly, some begged. All of them spoke over one another, yet I could hear pieces clearly, as if each voice had been placed directly beside my ear. Raven Gap, do you copy? Confirm Ranger on site. Eastern Ridge Lights observed. Samuel needs assistance. Tell my wife I made it to the tower. Evan Mercer. That one came from the digital base station. My name. Clean. Patient. I stood in the hallway with both hands pressed flat against the wall, trying not to move toward the room. The rule was simple. Power off until sunrise. The problem was that the radios were already on. I pulled the breaker panel open and killed the communications circuit. The ceiling lights died. The radios did not. In the dark, their displays kept glowing. Green, amber, red. A small constellation of equipment that should not have had power. The voices dropped suddenly into unison. Every speaker, every radio, every borrowed mouth. Raven Gap Station. Welfare check requested. I backed away. The floor felt uneven beneath my boots. Then the unison broke apart, and one voice rose above the others. Walter Griggs. Mercer. My breath caught. Don't listen, I whispered. His voice came again, cracked and urgent. Mercer, I'm below Bearwallow. I knew it was not him. I knew that. But I had called him twice, and he had not answered. That small absence became a handle the voice could pull. The digital radio clicked. Walter's voice lowered. You brought Harlan's badge back. That opened the route. I looked towards the desk drawer in the office. Closed, locked. The voice continued. They're at the ridge now. Outside, something moved against the porch steps. Not footsteps exactly. Pressure. Wood bending under weight. The radios hissed. Then another voice spoke. The missing boy. Gray hoodie, blue pack, left boot untied. Ranger Mercer, he said. You can still find me. I closed my eyes. The station felt full of people I had failed, people I had never met, people the mountain had kept long enough to learn. Then all the voices stopped, except one. A man I did not know. Calm? Professional? Very close. We finally found a way back. The front doorknob turned once, slowly. The rule sheet snapped against the wall in the radio vibration. I did the only thing left. I sat on the floor, put my hands over my ears, and waited for sunrise. Sunrise did not arrive like rescue. It arrived slowly, almost rudely, as if the mountain had never noticed what had happened in the dark. The first pale line of light appeared behind the ridge at 6:18. By then, I was still sitting on the hallway floor with my hands pressed over my ears and my back against the wall. The radios had gone silent at 5:57, not when the sky brightened, not when birds started calling. At 5:57, not sunrise, not mercy, a schedule, the same time written in 3 old logbooks beside the phrase, "Event concluded." That bothered me more than I wanted to admit. After sunrise, the station looked damaged in small, deniable ways. A drawer left open, a pencil snapped in half, the rule sheet loose at one corner, mud on the porch boards in a shape too smeared to call a footprint. Nothing that would convince a report reader. Everything that would convince the person who had survived it. I checked the desk drawer. Harlan's badge was still inside, cold now. I do not know why that disappointed me. Maybe part of me wanted it gone, because gone would have meant the night had taken back what belonged to it. Instead, it remained. Evidence, or bait. I spent the morning reading every logbook again, this time with no hope of finding a clean answer. By noon, I understood something simple. The rules had never been designed to stop Raven Gap. They were not locks. They were delays. Every rule bought time. Do not answer Channel 7 after sunset. Delay contact. End transmission if a voice identifies itself first. Delay recognition. Remain indoors during clear sky thunder. Delay movement. Do not investigate lights below the eastern ridgeline. Delay approach. Do not respond to Bearwallow welfare checks. Delay retrieval. Power off radios at 3:13. Delay whatever tried to cross when the valley was strongest. That was why the rules sounded incomplete. They were not explanations. They were survival margins written by people who only knew what had kept them alive until morning. I thought about Pike, Walter, Keller, Harlan, all the careful entries that avoided saying too much. No response given, logged only. Event concluded. Those were not cowardly phrases. They were instructions disguised as paperwork. The station had never been safe. It had only been survivable. That afternoon, Walter finally called. His voice sounded thin. "I lost the line last night," he said. I looked at the radios. "I heard you anyway." Walter was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That wasn't me." "I know." But knowing was not the same as believing. Not anymore. I told him what I had figured out. The rules did not defeat the thing in Raven Gap. They only prevented interaction long enough for daylight to cut the connection. Walter listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said one sentence that stayed with me longer than any rule. "That's all survival ever was up there, Mercer. Not winning, just refusing to answer until morning. I wanted the answer to be ghosts. That would have been easier. Ghosts belong to people. They carry names, grief, unfinished business. You can understand a ghost, even if you cannot help it." Raven Gap was not that kind. The logbooks never used the word haunted. Not once. They used operational language, signal event, contact attempt, identity mimicry, route activation. Those words mattered because rangers choose careful words when they are afraid a report might be read by someone who will dismiss anything emotional. By late afternoon, I had spread every map, logbook, and incident file across the office floor. Raven Gap Station, Eastern Ridgeline, Bearwallow Tower, 3 creek crossings, 5 disappearances. All of them formed a rough line through the valley. Not a trail, not a road, a seam. That was the only word that fit. Something under the mountain had an edge, and for decades, people had been stepping too close to it. The radio was not the thing itself. It was only the easiest way for the thing to reach us. Walter had been right. Channel 7 was a gap in the system. But the gap did not begin inside the equipment. It began somewhere below Bearwallow, under the old tower foundation, under the ridgeline where the lights moved without footsteps. The voices were not dead people coming home. They were impressions, copies, shapes made from memory, guilt, and whatever a person most wanted to hear. That made them worse than ghosts. A ghost asks to be remembered. This asked to be believed. I found one final note tucked inside Harlan's folder, written in pencil so faint I almost missed it. It does not know what a person is. It only knows what brings one closer. I read that sentence until the paper blurred. Then I understood why the voices made mistakes. Lake Briar instead of Briar Creek. Walter calling from below Bearwallow when Walter was alive miles away. A missing boy using the careful language of a ranger. It was not lying like a person lies. It was arranging bait. That night, I looked at the dark radios and realized the valley had not been trying to communicate. Communication requires 2 sides. Raven Gap was only learning which sounds made us open doors. And somewhere beneath the mountain, something was still practicing. I left Raven Gap 3 days after I found Harlan's badge and the note hidden in his file. Not because I suddenly became brave enough to resign, because the district closed the station. The official reason was infrastructure review. That phrase appeared in the email subject line like it had been waiting for a chance to become useful. The message cited electrical instability, storm damage, unreliable communications, budget limitations, and safety concerns related to remote staffing. Every explanation was ordinary. Every explanation was incomplete. A supervisor from district arrived with 2 maintenance workers and a clipboard. He asked about the generator, the radio interference, the porch damage, the broken drawer, and the muddy marks near the front steps. I answered carefully. Not falsely. Carefully. That was how Raven Gap taught people to talk. Possible electrical fault. Unknown weather-related pressure event. Unconfirmed signal interference. Wildlife activity near porch. The supervisor wrote everything down without looking surprised. That bothered me. People in authority have a way of not reacting when they already know which parts of a report to avoid. By noon, the maintenance workers had removed the newer digital base station, boxed the handheld units, and cut power to the communications room. They left the old analog radios bolted to the desk because nobody had brought the correct tools. I was glad. Then I hated myself for being glad. Before leaving, I took one final walk through the station. The bunk room was stripped. The kitchen smelled like bleach. The office bulletin board was bare, except for 4 pinholes where the district map had hung. In the communications room, the laminated rules still clung to the wall beside the dark equipment. No one removed them. No one mentioned them. I stood there long enough for the supervisor to call my name from the hallway. Mercer? Coming? But I did not move right away. I looked at Rule 6. At 3:13 a.m., all radios must remain powered off until sunrise, regardless of incoming traffic. For the first time, I noticed a 7th indentation below it, faint beneath the laminate, as if another line had once been typed and removed. Most of the words were gone. Only a few impressions remained, enough to read fragments. Station closes. Radio equipment. Below the ridge. I could not make out the rest. Maybe the paper had faded. Maybe somebody had removed it deliberately. Either way, I suddenly understood why someone had hidden the line. I left Harlan's badge in the top desk drawer. Evidence. Or bait. I still do not know which. Outside, the forest looked clean after rain. Sunlight touched the wet leaves. The eastern ridgeline stood quiet and blue, giving no sign of lights, thunder, or anything beneath it that knew how to speak. The supervisor locked the station door. Then he handed me a reassignment packet. I asked what would happen to Raven Gap. He looked toward the trees. Decommissioned. For how long? He paused. Officially? That was all the answer I needed. I drove down the access road without turning on the radio. Not the truck radio. Not my phone. Not even when the signal returned near the highway. For 2 months, no one contacted me about Raven Gap. No follow-up interview. No internal review. No request for the missing badge. The station disappeared from public maps quietly, the way Keller had disappeared from the logbook. No announcement. No explanation. Just absence filed under maintenance closure. And for a while, I let myself believe absence meant silence. Silence lasted 73 days. I counted at first without meaning to, then stopped, because counting made it feel like I was waiting. I took a reassignment at a visitor center 2 counties east. Flat trails, school groups, lost wallets, weekend hikers asking where to find waterfalls close to parking. My new radio stayed clipped to my belt, but I kept the volume low. No Channel 7. No thunder under clear skies. No lights moving below ridgelines after midnight. For a while, ordinary life performed well enough to fool me. Then the package arrived. No return address. No delivery notice. Just a cardboard box left outside my apartment door before sunrise. My name was printed on the label in block letters. Evan Mercer. Inside was an old analog radio. Not similar. The same one from Raven Gap. Yellowed label. Scratched dial. Dust caught under the speaker grill. Taped to the side was a torn strip of laminate. 3 typed fragments remained. If station closes. No radio equipment. Below the ridge. I stood in my kitchen, staring at it, while morning traffic moved beyond the window. That was the worst part. The world kept going. A bus hissed at the curb. Someone laughed on the sidewalk. My refrigerator clicked on. All of it normal. All of it useless. I should have called Walter. I should have thrown the radio in the river. Instead, I set it on the table and watched it like a live animal. The display was dark. No battery pack. No power cord. No reason for it to make sound. At 3:13 that afternoon, the speaker clicked once. Static filled my kitchen. Then a calm voice spoke. Raven Gap Station. Welfare check requested. I did not move. The voice waited. Then it said my full name. Evan Mercer. My mouth went dry. It was not in the mountains anymore. That was the thought that made me step back. Not fear. Understanding. The voice continued, softer now. You came below the ridge. The radio hissed. Something tapped once against my apartment door. Then again. Not hard, not urgent, patient, like someone who knew I would eventually answer. I looked at the torn rule fragment beside the radio. If station closes, no radio equipment, below the ridge. Now I knew the missing rule. I had not brought the radio down. But someone had, and Raven Gap had followed it. The speaker clicked again. This time, the voice sounded like Walter Griggs. Tired, close, almost kind. Don't make yourself useful, Mercer. Then, from the other side of my apartment door, my own voice answered him. Too late.